The Texas sun blazed white that morning. Dust swirled along the dirt road like smoke as the trucks rumbled toward the camp. Inside, 23 women sat in silence. Their German uniforms were faded, faces drawn, hands clasped tightly in their laps. They didn't speak. They didn't meet each other's eyes. They simply waited for the next order, the next humiliation. They were prisoners now. Nurses, clerks, radio operators, all captured in Italy and North Africa. Soldiers without weapons. The war had ended months before, yet for them, its shadow still lingered. Every road seemed to lead away from home. The convoy left the highway and followed a narrow track lined with mesquite trees bowing over the path. Somewhere ahead, a windmill creaked in the heat. Then, in the distance, the camp appeared, a small cluster of buildings fenced not with steel or barbed wire, but simple wooden rails. No guard towers, just open sky and quiet. The trucks stopped, engines idling, doors swung open. The women stepped into the scorching sunlight, squinting. A group of men waited, cowboys in worn uniforms, hats shading their faces. They didn't shout, they didn't smile, just observed quietly. One of them, tall, sunburned, stepped forward. Captain Dale Cooper, a rancher before the war, now the camp's commanding officer. He nodded once. "Welcome to Camp Hearn, ladies." The women froze. They hadn't expected soft English. They hadn't expected welcome. Annalise Brandt, a nurse from Bremen, stared at the wooden barracks. She whispered to the woman beside her, "Where are the cells?" "There aren't any," Cooper said, overhearing. "Your quarters are in there." They followed the direction of his hand and stopped again. Inside, sunlight fell across rows of beds. Real beds, with mattresses, sheets, pillows, clean. No straw, no mud, no chains. For a moment, no one moved. One woman pressed a hand to the cotton sheet as if it might vanish. Another murmured, "This is a trick." Cooper turned to his sergeant. "They look like they've seen ghosts," the sergeant muttered. "Guess they have." The women didn't sit, didn't lie down. They just lingered by the beds, hesitant to touch what seemed too kind to be real. Outside, the windmill creaked again, slow and rhythmic, drawing water from an old well. The air smelled of dust and linen. That night, long after the sun had dropped, and the guards turned off the lights, the women stayed awake. They lay stiff on the sheets, hands folded on their chests, as if comfort were a punishment they hadn't earned. One whispered into the dark, "It smells like peace, but peace, like the bed beneath me, feels unreal." They believed the Americans would despise them. That was what they had been told. By officers, by rumor, by the war itself. "Americans don't take prisoners," one sergeant had said. "If they do, you'll wish they hadn't." For months, that fear had been their armor, keeping them quiet, obedient, invisible. Now, that same fear betrayed them. At Camp Hearn, nothing fit what they had prepared for. No shouting, no searchlights, no bayonets, just the soft rhythm of boots, the scent of hay and clean wood, the strange civility of men who tipped their hats instead of aiming rifles. Some whispered that it was a trick, that the kindness would end at sunset. Others said it was a humiliation in disguise, a way to remind them they were broken. Even the guards were uneasy. They had expected arrogance, steel-spined women of the Reich who refused to bow. Instead, they found pale faces, trembling hands, and silence heavy enough to choke on. Sergeant Clay Morgan muttered, "They don't even look at us." Cooper replied, "Maybe they don't know how anymore." The first hours passed in uneasy stillness. The women unpacked their few belongings: soap, combs, folded photographs. One held a small leather Bible, another a blood-stained nurse's armband she could not part with. When Cooper's men handed out clean sheets and blankets, the women froze again. "They're prisoners, not guests," one guard said under his breath. Cooper didn't answer. "Everyone sleeps under the same sky," he said quietly. "They deserve something soft beneath them." That night, he passed the barracks and looked through the window. None of the beds had been disturbed. Every woman sat upright, back straight, eyes open. He shook his head. "They're afraid to rest." "They don't think they deserve it," Morgan said. The misunderstanding was no longer about war. It was about worth. The women believed comfort belonged only to the innocent. The guards assumed mercy made people weak. Both were wrong. Kindness was not weakness. It was disarmament. In the barracks, where the air smelled of dust and lavender, soap, both sides learned that the hardest challenge after war is not forgiveness. It is granting permission to stop fighting. In the dark, Annalise whispered, "They want us to sleep." "Why?" No one answered. Neither side yet knew this was the start of a new kind of battle, the quiet war between guilt and grace. And as the Texas wind crept through the cracks of the wooden walls, both sides lay awake, unsure who the prisoners really were. Not cruelty, but confusion. Not hatred, but hesitation. Not surrender, but silence. By morning, the sheets were still smooth. The war was over, but disbelief had just begun. Before Texas, most of the women had known only ruin. Bombed cities, hospitals roofless, blood-stained hallways. They were not combatants. They were the hands behind the war. Nurses, clerks, radio operators, translators. Some had joined out of duty, others because they had nowhere else to go. When the Allied armies advanced, they were taken with the wounded, treated like soldiers. By August 1945, the U.S. Army was overwhelmed with prisoners. 425,000 German POWs were scattered across America, from New Jersey to California. Texas alone held nearly 50,000 in 24 camps. Only a few were women, fewer than 120 in the entire state. The government didn't know what to do with them, so they were sent to Camp Hearn, an old camp once used for youth trainees and captured Luftwaffe pilots. It sat just outside the town of Hearn, on land that had once been a cattle ranch. Wide fields, old windmills, the scent of alfalfa. It didn't look like a prison, just wooden barracks behind a split-rail fence. The townspeople called it the camp with no barbed wire. Captain Dale Cooper was put in charge. He wasn't a typical officer. Before the war, he'd run a ranch outside Abilene, a place where rules were simple. If a man worked, he earned his rest. He didn't like cruelty, didn't like waste. When the army assigned him to guard prisoners, he told his men, "You treat them how you'd want your sister treated, no matter what patch they wore." The women arrived that September, exhausted, silent. The train from Galveston had carried them inland under guard through cotton fields and open sky. Along the way, they'd stared out the windows, unable to believe the land belonged to their captors. It was too quiet, too wide, too alive. When they reached the camp, Cooper had ordered every bed made with white sheets. The army had overstock from quartermaster supply. Hundreds of unused cots, mattresses, and pillows from demobilized barracks. To him, it wasn't kindness, it was order. If you give people a place that's clean, he said, they'll stay calm. But for the women, it was incomprehensible. Annalisa Brandt, 24, had spent her last months of the war in a field hospital near Milan. sleeping on cold tiles beside dying soldiers. The first night in Camp Hearn, she touched the cotton sheet and felt her throat close. She thought of the men she couldn't save, the blood she couldn't wash off. She couldn't lie down. Across the room, her friend Irma whispered, "It's just a bed." Annalisa answered, "No, it's too much." The camp doctor, Major Henry Pike, made his rounds the next morning. He noted in his log, "Prisoners appear underfed, but cooperative. Unusual reaction to sleeping quarters, hesitant to use beds. Psychological shock." He didn't understand it either. Everything about Camp Hearn ran on statistics. 1,000 calories per day, 8 hours of work, 2 showers a week, lights out at 9. Fair, precise, predictable. But the one thing the Army couldn't quantify was mercy. The numbers said they were safe. The women didn't believe them. When Cooper's men delivered extra pillows that evening, one guard muttered, "They're enemies, not guests." Cooper just said, "Maybe we're testing who we really are." Outside, the Texas sun went down over the fences. Inside, 23 women sat beside clean beds they still couldn't bring themselves to use. Not revenge, but restraint. Not luxury, but logic. Not compassion, but consequence. The kind that makes even mercy feel like guilt. And that night in the barracks at Camp Hearn, the war found a new shape. It wasn't fought with weapons anymore. It was fought with the unbearable weight of kindness. War had always been measured in destruction. Bombs dropped, tons of steel, bodies counted, cities erased. But in Texas, the numbers told a stranger story. 4 or 25,000 German PSWs on American soil. 50,000 housed in Texas. Only 120 were women. The rest were men who worked the fields, cut lumber, built barns, even picked cotton alongside locals. For most, captivity was cleaner than the front lines. The U.S. Army called it humane containment. The Geneva Convention called it reciprocity. But to the women who arrived at Camp Hearn, it felt like something else entirely. Disbelief measured by inches. Each barracks held 12 beds. Each bed had 1 mattress, 1 pillow, 1 sheet, 1 blanket. That was the Army standard. 12 Bonosa, 12 feet per person, 68 jute interior temperature, 3,000 calories daily. The women didn't know what to do with those numbers. They'd just come from Italy, where hospital floors were wet with blood and glass, where sleep meant leaning against a wall until dawn. Now they stood beside beds that smelled faintly of soap and starch, touched cotton as clean as clouds, and froze. Anna kept her hands folded. "Beds," she said softly. "For us," Irma shook her head. "It's a mistake. They'll take them back." That night, none of them slept. They sat upright backs against walls, as if comfort might explode. Outside, Cooper's men ran their rounds. Private Morgan, the youngest guard, peeked through a window and whispered, "They're all still awake, sir." Cooper said, "Give it time." By morning, every bed was still perfectly made. Not a wrinkle, not a dent. The women had lain down and risen again without disturbing a thing. Cooper sighed. "They think it's a trap." He told the doctor to keep notes. If they didn't sleep, they'll break. But the doctor's report only turned it into data. Adjustment period prolonged. Possible guilt response. No disciplinary issues. Numbers can record everything except pain. 3 nights later, one woman, a young stenographer named Elle, finally lay down. She covered herself with the blanket and cried silently until she fell asleep. The next morning, the others found her bed unmade. She tried to apologize, thinking she'd broken a rule. Cooper walked in, saw the wrinkled sheets, and smiled. "Now that's the first right thing anyone's done here." That afternoon, Moore followed her lead. Beds began to change shape. Pillows held the faint imprint of heads. The guards stopped talking about enemies. They started talking about people. Within a week, the camp supply officer reported a shortage of soap and fresh linen. Within 2 weeks, the Red Cross inspection log noted remarkable morale. In the ledgers, mercy looked like math: 0 escapes, 0 discipline issues, 100% health compliance. But the numbers hid the truth. For the women, sleep was more terrifying than hunger. For Themen, kindness was heavier than duty. Annalisa wrote in her small notebook, "I have not slept without fear since 1939. Last night, I did. I don't know what that makes me." The report called it recovery. She called it surrender, not cruelty, but calculation, not punishment, but proof. That even peace can feel like defeat when you no longer know what to do with it. By the end of that month, Camp Hearn had the cleanest barracks in Texas. The women made their beds perfectly each morning, as if saying thank you through the fold of a sheet. The Army called it efficiency, but every wrinkle pressed smooth was really an apology, written in linen, in silence, in the strange arithmetic of forgiveness. The night the experiment began, no one called it that. It was just another Texas evening: crickets, dust, and a heat that refused to fade. The guards had made their rounds. The lights were out, and the camp was silent. But inside the women's barracks, no one slept. The beds were untouched again. Captain Cooper finally stepped inside. The air smelled of starch and fear. 23 women sat upright, dressed, boots by the door, like they were waiting for judgment. Cooper looked at them quietly, then at the neat rows of beds. "You can lie down, you know," he said softly. "That's what they're for." No one moved. He pointed to the nearest cot. "It's clean. It's yours." Annalisa met his eyes for the first time. "We don't deserve them," she said in careful English. He frowned. "Des what? This?" She gestured toward the beds. "Softness." Cooper took a breath. "Ma'am, you've been through hell. These aren't gifts. They're what's left when hell's over." No one answered. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "You fought your war. Ours is to make sure it stays finished. That starts with sleep." When he left, the women still sat still, but something cracked in the silence. One of them, Elle, the youngest, took off her boots and lay down. She didn't pull up the blanket, just rested her head on the pillow. The others watched. The world didn't end. Irma followed. Then Annalisa. Within minutes, every bed was filled. The sound of breathing replaced the hum of fear. One woman began to cry. The rest pretended not to hear her. Outside, Cooper walked back to the guard post. Private Morgan was waiting. "They down yet?" "Yeah," Cooper said. "They're down," Morgan hesitated. "Feels strange, don't it? Letting them rest?" Cooper took off his hat, wiped his brow. "Feels right, though." The next morning, the sun came up pale and gold over the camp. For the first time since their arrival, the women didn't stand at dawn roll call. Already dressed, they stumbled out late, hair uncombed, faces flushed from real sleep. When the guards saw that, no one laughed. Annalisa blinked in the sunlight, her voice small. "It smelled like home," she said. That day, they made the beds differently. Not with military corners, but with care, tucking in the corners like they'd done for family, not officers. It wasn't obedience. It was something closer to trust. In Themisol, the guards noticed the change, too. The women spoke softly among themselves. One even smiled. That afternoon, Cooper ordered new linens from the quartermaster. "They're sleeping," he said. "We'll need more." His sergeant stared. "We're giving prisoners clean sheets." "Yeah," Cooper said. "And we're keeping them that way." That night when the lights went out, the barracks stayed quiet. No shifting, no whispers, just slow, even breathing like the sound of a field after harvest. Empty, peaceful, waiting. It was the first true silence since the war. Cooper wrote one line in his nightly report. All prisoners rested without incident. Air smelled of laundry and rain. The next day, an army inspector arrived unannounced. He walked through the camp, clipboard in hand, checking for order, discipline, compliance. When he reached the women's barracks, he paused. The beds were made neatly, the air clean. The women saluted politely, their eyes calm. "Discipline appears excellent," he said. Cooper nodded. "No, sir, it's not discipline," the inspector frowned. "Then what?" "Relief!" That word didn't fit in the report, but it was the truth. Not command, not control, just quiet mercy. And for a moment in the heart of Texas, that was enough to end a war all over again. Kindness was never meant to be measured, but the Army did it anyway. Every week, Captain Cooper filed the same report. No disturbances, no illness, high morale. The higher-ups called Camp Hearn an efficiency model, but inside those wooden walls, something less stable was forming. Mercy had its own weight. The women began to change. They ate more, spoke more, smiled when spoken to. Yet beneath the calm, there was tension, a quiet confusion about what to feel. They'd been trained to see Americans as monsters. Now they were being tucked into beds by them. Their shame grew heavier than their chains. Annalisa wrote in her notebook, "They treat us gently. It hurts worse than hatred." The guards didn't escape the math either. Cooper noticed his men losing the edge soldiers were supposed to have. They called the women ma'am. They brought extra bread to the barracks. One gave up his spare Bible. Another offered to fix a woman's broken shoe. When Cooper caught him, the man just said, "Feels wrong not to." It wasn't discipline breaking. It was empathy, slow and contagious. Private Morgan said one evening, "Sir, they don't look like prisoners no more." Cooper stared out at the fence. "That's the point, isn't it?" But the point scared him. The war had taught men to dehumanize, to simplify, friend or foe, good or evil, us or them. Now every small kindness unraveled that Clean division. Each sheet washed, each meal served, each good-night gesture chipped away at what the uniform used to mean. It was arithmetic, with no winner. By November, the reports changed tone. 0 incidents, 0 disobedience, 0 distance. The women had become part of the rhythm of the camp. They sang quietly while they worked. The guards didn't stop them. One night, Morgan stood outside the barracks and said, "You hear that, sir? That ain't enemy sound." And said, "You hear that, sir? That ain't enemy sound." Cooper nodded. "No, that's just people remembering how to be human." But mercy can turn inward like guilt. Some of the women started refusing rations, eating less. They told the camp doctor they didn't deserve the food. One said, "We were cruel once. You shouldn't feed us kindness now." The doctor wrote psychological adjustment in his notes. Cooper read it and felt sick. Anala told him one afternoon, "We don't know how to sleep without remembering." He said quietly, "You're not supposed to forget. You're supposed to rest." She looked at him and said, "Is there a difference?" He didn't answer. The Army's clean numbers kept coming. No violence, no rebellion, no failures. But those figures missed what was happening in silence. A slow collapse of guilt under the weight of grace. One guard put it simply, "They're not prisoners anymore. They're ghosts trying to feel alive." Cooper tried to steady the balance, had heightened schedules, reintroduced inspections, reminded his men that rules kept them safe. But the damage or the healing was already done. Not cruelty, but conscience. Not hate, but heaviness. Not forgiveness. But the long, hard math of learning how, that. Winter frost crept across the windows of Camp Hearn. The Sinum fields went white, and the air carried no sound but the creak of the windmill and the soft breathing of women who finally slept through the night. Mercy had done its work. It had leveled everything. Rank, guilt, distance until all that was left was exhaustion and a quiet kind of peace neither side could name. October 1945. A thunderstorm rolled in from the west, the kind that split the Texas sky in half. Rain came hard and sudden, hammering the tin roofs of Camp Hearn until they sang. The guards had barely made it to shelter when the first leak started. A steady drip through the women's barrack ceiling, soaking the clean sheets they had just folded that morning. The women rushed to move theirs, covering them with their coats, trying to keep them dry. For a moment, the storm drowned everything. Voices, orders, even thought. It was chaos, but a different kind than war. This was ordinary, human, inconvenient. Then the door burst open. Captain Cooper stood there, rain plastering his uniform to his shoulders. Behind him came 3 guards carrying tarps, nails, and hammers. Annalise froze. "You shouldn't come in," she said. "We'll handle it." Cooper shook his head. "Not tonight." He stepped inside, water dripping from his hat. "Grab the buckets. We'll need a line." For the next hour, soldiers and prisoners worked together. The women held lamps while the guards patched the holes. One climbed onto Attable to reach the rafters, boots slipping on wet wood. Cooper steadied him, his hand pressed against the same beam that Annalisa was holding from the other side. For the first time, they looked at each other, not as jailer and captive, but as 2 people trapped under the same leaking roof. The storm didn't stop. Lightning flashed white against the windows. The camp dogs barked. Somewhere, a water tank overflowed. When the last tarp was nailed in place, Cooper stood back, drenched and breathing hard. That should hold. Annalisa nodded, her hair soaked, her hands trembling. "Why?" she asked. "Why? What? Why help us?" He hesitated. The answer was simple, but saying it felt dangerous. "Because you were wet." The room went quiet except for the rain. He tipped his hat, nodded once, and left. When the door shut behind him, the women stood still for a long time. Then one of them, Irma, whispered in German, "Enemies don't do that." Anala didn't reply. She just looked at the patched ceiling, the hammer marks glinting under lamplight, and thought, maybe the war really is over. Outside, the guards worked through the night, checking every barracks, ceiling, every roof. The rain turned to mist by dawn. At breakfast, the women found extra coffee on their tables, left without explanation. They didn't ask. They just drank it slowly, staring at the steam. When Cooper filled out his daily log, he wrote, "Storm damage minimal. No injuries. Roof repaired with joint assistance. Spirits steady." Then under his breath he added, "Better than steady." That night, the bed smelled faintly of frayne and sawdust. No one had to be told to sleep. In their own way, both sides had passed a test no manual could describe. Not orders, but instinct. Not rules. Butte respect. Not war, but weather. Something that made them all small again, and equal beneath it. By morning, the ground steamed under the Texas sun, and the camp looked cleaner, newer, alive. For the first time since the trucks had arrived, the women began to hum while they worked. The guards didn't stop them. The storm had broken something, but what it left behind was stronger. December 1945. Winter came soft to Texas that year. Cold enough for frost on the fences, but never snow. The mornings were pale and thin. The women still worked the same routine, kitchen duty, sewing, tending the small garden behind the barracks, but they moved slower now, conserving warmth, conserving energy. Then one morning, one of them collapsed. Her name was Greta Hoffman, a radio operator from Hamburg. She had been coughing for days, hiding it with a handkerchief. When the fever came, it came fast. The guards carried her to the infirmary, her face gray, eyes unfocused. Captain Cooper stood outside while the doctor examined her. Major Pike came out an hour later, his expression unreadable. "Pneumonia," he said. "She needs warmth, food, and rest." "The barracks are too cold," Cooper said. Pike nodded. "She won't make it through the night out there." So they did something no manual covered. They moved her into Pike's own quarters, the only room in the camp with a proper bed, a stove, and thick blankets. When Greta woke up, the doctor was sitting nearby reading an old copy of Life magazine. She blinked, confused. "Where am I?" "In my quarters," Pike said. "You're safe." She stared at the bed. It was soft, white, warm. "This is for officers," she whispered. He shrugged. "Not tonight." She turned her face toward the wall and began to cry. "We treated your men on cold floors," she said. "They died there. We didn't help all of them." Pike closed the magazine. Then that's the difference between losing and learning. He poured her water, adjusted the blanket, and said quietly, "You're not my enemy anymore, Greta. You're just sick." She nodded weakly, tears wetting the pillow. That night, when Cooper came to check on her, he saw the doctor asleep in the chair beside her bed. Greta was breathing evenly, her hand resting outside the blanket. The fire crackled low. Cooper didn't speak. He just stood there a moment, watching two people who were never meant to share the same air, now sharing silence. Outside, frost glimmered on the roofs. The camp was still. By morning, Greta's fever broke. She survived. When she was strong enough to walk again, she asked Pike if she could return to the barracks. He said yes, but he left the bed made up just in case. When Cherie joined the others, they listened as she told the story. "He sat with me all night," she said softly. "I thought it was pity. It wasn't. It was respect." The other women didn't know how to answer. They just stared at the floor. Annalise finally spoke. "That's how you end a war," she said. The guards noticed the difference after that. The women worked with a new rhythm. Quiet, steady, cooperative. They started leaving small things for the guards. Folded handkerchiefs, mended sleeves, polished boots. Not gifts, not submission, just acknowledgement. Private Morgan found one note tucked under a mug in the mess hall. It read simply, "Donka for the bed." He didn't show it to anyone. He just kept it in his pocket until the paper wore thin. When the Army inspector came again that month, he asked Cooper, "You've had no incidents, no tension?" "None," Cooper said. The inspector wrote something on his clipboard. "Good discipline," Cooper smiled faintly. "No, sir." "Good beds." By the end of that winter, Camp Hearn had become a place where the past was still present, but softer now, less like a wound, more like a scar that had finally begun to fade. Not victory, but virtue, not surrender, but survival, not power, but decency, the kind that asks for nothing in return. And in that quiet between ration bells and Texas wind, 23 women and a handful of cowboys learned what the world had nearly forgotten: how to stop being enemies. By spring 1946, the war was long over, but Camp Hearn still breathed like something alive. The women worked the fields now without guards following. They washed clothes, tended gardens, painted fences. At night, they sang quietly in German, songs about rivers and home, not about victory or loss. The guards didn't understand the words, but they didn't need to. The sound itself was peace. Captain Cooper's final inspection came in April. The Army was closing the smaller camps, preparing to repatriate prisoners. His clipboard was heavy with numbers, all neat and clean. 23 prisoners, 0 incidents, 100% good conduct, 0 escapes. The kind of perfection that didn't happen in wartime reports. He walked the grounds one last time. The fences were weathered, the roofs patched from that storm months ago. The air smelled of cut grass and soap. When he reached the women's barracks, Annalisa stood at the door, waiting. She held out a folded piece of paper. "For you," she said. He unfolded it. Inside was a single sentence written carefully in German. "You made us sleep like people again." He swallowed hard. "You did that yourselves," he said. She smiled faintly. "No, you gave us the chance." That night, Cooper wrote his last report. Camp Hearn Female Detachment. Healthy, cooperative, ready for transfer. Recommend closure of facility. Beds remain intact. Then, without thinking, he added a line that didn't belong in any military file. "Peace feels like laundry drying in the sun." A week later, trucks arrived to transport the women south toward Galveston, where ships awaited to carry them back to Europe. The camp gathered to watch. The guards remained by the gate, hats removed, rifles resting at their sides yet inactive. As the women passed, none saluted. They only nodded, heads lowered, expressions softened. Annalisa paused at the truck's step. "Captain," she said, "in Germany, We were taught America had no heart." He studied her. "And now?" She smiled, weary but genuine. "Now I think maybe that's how it wins wars." The trucks rumbled away, engines fading into the dusty horizon. Afterward, Cooper walked through the empty barracks. The beds remained neatly made, pillows still bearing the impressions of the previous night. He sat on one, pressing his hand into the mattress, feeling the faint echo of warmth lingering in the fabric. He whispered, "They didn't just sleep. They healed." Outside, the sun sank behind the fences. The guards did not cheer or shed tears. They stood quietly, like men who had witnessed something sacred and could not name it. Weeks later, the army dismantled the camp. Lumber went to nearby ranches. One bed frame found its way to Cooper's barn, leaning against the wall. Sometimes he glanced at it while tending tools, recalling the rain striking tin roofs and women breathing softly in the darkness. Not conquest, but conscience. Not hatred, but honor. Not victory, but virtue. The rare kind that leaves no medals, only memories. Years later, Annalisa wrote to an American journalist, "We lost our homeland, but in Texas, we discovered our humanity." That became the lasting truth of Camp Hearn. The war began in ideology but ended quietly, in the rhythm of sleep. By summer 1952, the old fences were gone. The land had returned to ranchers, the barracks reduced to timber. Only the windmill remained, creaking over an empty field, drawing the same water that once filled tin tubs for prisoners. Captain Dale Cooper was no longer a captain. He was back on his ranch near Abilene, slower, grayer, still rising before dawn. Against the back wall of his barn stood a single bed frame, saved from the camp. The wood was scratched, the paint faded. He never used it. Once, his 10-year-old grandson asked, "Grandpa, why keep that old thing?" Cooper smiled, eyes distant. "Because once, a bed ended a war." The boy laughed, thinking it a joke, but Cooper remained silent. "It wasn't bullets," he said quietly. "It was mercy." Occasionally, when the wind blew just right, the scent of dust and cotton would drift through the barn doors, and for a moment he could almost hear it again. The rustle of bedding, faint laughter, soft German voices under Texas stars, the sound of peace, learning how to breathe. Across the ocean in Bremen, Annalisa Brandt returned to nursing. She married, raised 2 children, and spoke little of Camp Hearn until old age. In a 1967 letter, she wrote, "When they gave us beds, we cried. It wasn't comfort, it was confession. They forgave us before we even asked." She concluded with a line still preserved in the Hearn Museum. "They gave us soft pillows and hard truths." That was the measure of Texas mercy. No parades, no speeches, just quiet men and fragile women discovering that the opposite of war isn't peace. It's dignity. Not conquest, but kindness. Not orders, but understanding. Not surrender, but sleep. And on those hot Texas nights, when the air held still and the stars shone white, the memory lingered of prisoners who dared to close their eyes and cowboys who looked away so they could. They came as enemies. They left as human beings. And for one delicate moment, the world remembered what mercy sounds like. Remembered what mercy sounds like.